Hello there. My name is Jeremiah, and this is UnExamined. Have you ever noticed that Americans seem to be further to the left than the majority of the politicians who represent them? Maybe not on the surface level, but ideologically, Americans on a political graph tend to fall further to the left and have broad support for leftist policies, even though leftists really isn't represented. Medicare for All, for example, is a policy that is supported by almost half of Republicans and 69% of Democrats. Nice! So, if that's true, and if the majority of Americans do support these type policies, then why do we keep getting Republican politicians, much less corporate and centrist Democrats, elected into office? If Americans are generally speaking further to the left, how does this keep happening? That is a loaded question. And while there are plenty of answers from gerrymandering, corporate lobbying, and just general voter suppression, the thing I'd like to focus on today is how people on the left actually end up pushing people further right who maybe are more uninformed. How does this happen? Why does this keep happening? And why do people seem to vote against their own interests? Correct me if you've heard this one before. You're arguing with someone, either a friend or a stranger, and you happen to know a lot about the issue, and they seem to insist that you're wrong. So in order to cut things straight real quick, you Google it up on your phone, you provide them a list of 12 different articles saying why the truth is what it is, but rather than their friend changing their answer and recognizing that they were incorrect, they double down and they say that you're just providing biased news sources of information and not actually having a good faith argument. This is cognitive dissonance, and it happens when an individual has a belief or worldview that is challenged, and then they create an irrational explanation in order to prevent their worldview from being destroyed. This isn't some abnormality. This happens all the time to everyone on either side of the political spectrum. And in fact, you yourself have probably done it quite recently. And it's also the source for much of the current problems with American political discourse. So what leads people to having a right-wing political worldview that clashes with their left-wing ideologies? Again, this is a loaded question, but what I'd like to focus on today is specifically how the left can further push these people right. The first and most obvious answer is that the left tends to elect uninspiring corporate centrists who will, generally speaking, enforce the status quo and refuse to implement any structural, real change. In 2016, Trump and Hillary Clinton were two of the most unpopular candidates in history for the presidency. Yet, while Hillary represented the same aspects that I mentioned before, Trump was able to rally people around him who saw him as an outsider. He wasn't just another politician, he was someone who represented change from the norm. And this inspired a lot of people who don't usually get involved in politics to rally around him. You would think that Democrats would have learned their lesson and 4 years later presented someone who represented something new. But instead, of course, as we all know, we got Joe Biden. Despite being one of the most unpopular presidents in history, Trump was able to gather millions of votes and gave Biden a fairly close run for the election. Joe Biden's margin of victory over Trump was much smaller than people expected it to be. And it's also worth pointing out that Democrats actually lost seats in the House and have not managed to flip the Senate as of this filming. So I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if Democrats chose a candidate who actually represented real structural change rather than another corporate centrist? Americans from both sides of the aisle don't view this so much as a compromise, but as a betrayal. And so what ends up happening is we play this awful game of tug of war, and no change gets implemented no matter whose wins. Which brings us to our next problem, the umbrella. Now, many people who identify themselves as leftists are probably already hammering away on the keyboards, going to tell me, Joe Biden is not a leftist. So if you see that comment, you know they didn't even make it this far in the video. So, to clarify, Joe Biden technically would not register on the left on a political compass. While Joe Biden would technically be categorized as off-right, what we need to be aware of is that in America, he is to the left of the right-wing candidates. So for sake of lack of confusion for anyone who is not familiar with the terms, we're going to say that he's on the left. Many Democrats refer to this as the coalition or the umbrella, which they use as a term to describe that all ideologies on the left are welcome under one umbrella. The problem is that doesn't really work out. The left doesn't really exist as one unified body of ideas. In fact, it's much less of a coalition as it is a loosely grouped together mixture of different ideologies and viewpoints, loosely held together by tribalism and gumdrops. So this ends up leading to a tremendous amount of infighting between the groups. You have progressives and Democrats and everyone else all fighting for power, and what ends up happening is that the most centrist and electable candidates end up being chosen because they're afraid that radical candidates are just going to be so rejected by the right that no change ends up happening. American politics not only don't represent anyone on the left, but they actively work to suppress them in order to not upset the balance of power. If the American left ever wants to subvert this and actually bring people from the right over and implement real change, then we're going to have to get away from these corporate Democrats. Corporate politicians work actively against the interests of people because they don't represent those people. They represent the corporations. And if the left or the American people in general ever want to get past this, then we as a whole are going to have to make sure that we stop electing corporate Democrats who don't represent change. And we have to kick them out of every single branch of government. Okay, Jeremiah, you're telling me that we need less corrupt leaders and broader representation. But those problems, they're bigger than me. I'm one person. I can't affect change on that systemic level. What can I do? I'm glad you asked, person I'm pretending is there. What you can do is fix yourself. Okay, maybe fix yourself is a bit dramatic. But what I'm trying to get at here is that the left as a whole has a PR problem. And what I mean when I say that is that people who vote right tend to see us as arrogant, condescending jerks. We can come off quite hypocritical when we sit here and talk about things like toxicity, but then we're not afraid to go out and bash on people who are uneducated or uninformed and make them feel stupid. Have you ever noticed how the talking heads in the media, like Stephen Colbert and all the different news reporters, they have no problem mocking Trump. But even when it comes to certain things that they would normally never think of mocking someone else, they're okay to mock him. Oh my God, he's so fat. He likes hamburgers. He's so ugly. Let's just make fun of all these things about him, rather than address the systemic problems that he's created while in office. You see, it's okay to make fun of someone and call them fat just as long as they don't agree with us. And to people who are on the right, they see this for exactly what it is: hypocrisy. But it's not just that. Have you ever noticed that groups online tend to do the same thing? Like, anytime I go onto Facebook or YouTube and I see political comments going back and forth, it's never just the Trump voters and the Republicans who are being belligerent and disrespectful. It does happen on both sides, where one side is calling the other stupid and the other side is saying, America! No one, not one single person, has ever changed their opinion when someone was treating them this way. I grew up in a conservative household with Republican parents, Republican grandparents, friends, family. Everyone in my immediate bubble was a conservative, evangelical Republican. This bubble that I lived in led to me to use cognitive dissonance to prevent myself from asking questions that would distance me from all the friends and family that I had that believed the same things. If I challenged my worldview, that meant that I was going to have to isolate myself and break away from everything that I knew. And that just wasn't something I was comfortable with. And anytime I did have my views challenged, it was mostly challenged by people who were quite aggressive with their beliefs and were more trying to attack me rather than change my mind. Almost all of us live inside these bubbles. Even as leftists, centrists, liberals, whatever your party is, we live and tend to isolate ourselves in communities that think, act, behave, and even look like ourselves. We brainwash ourselves into a certain worldview, and when that worldview is challenged, our immediate reaction is to reject the new information and throw it away. Conservatives are no different. People who vote conservative oftentimes are voting against their own interests, and even though that's true, if everyone in their environment tends to push them further to the right and gives them that conservative viewpoint, then they're going to vote against those own interests because they're not trying to challenge their world. So how do we get someone to challenge their own beliefs? There is no one bulletproof answer to this, obviously. But in my experience, the thing that helps the most is to take a little bit of advice from a little old guy named Socrates. No, but seriously, the Socratic method is invaluable when having political discussions with someone and you're trying to challenge their worldview. Socrates was known as one of the wisest men in Athens, in fact, the wisest. And the reason for this wasn't because he was incredibly smart, but because he understood the most fundamental thing, that he didn't know anything. Anytime Socrates wanted to challenge a worldview or to learn more about a topic, he would find himself asking the experts. He would go to an expert in their field and he would ask them question after question, and what he would end up finding out is that the more questions he asked, the more unsure of themselves they became. That's why he knew that the only thing that he could justifiably say is that he didn't know anything. Whereas all the people who were so-called experts, they didn't even know that. So Socrates wouldn't just go up to someone and say, "Oh, well, Trump's a bad guy, and here's an article proving it, honey." No, Socrates would take a different approach. He would walk up to them and he would ask, "All right, well, why do you think that Trump is a good person? Why do you have these conservative values? Why are you against socialism? Why do you think socialism is evil? And what do you think about these socialist policies that already exist?" You see, when you start off with a question, you're not presenting them with an answer that they can reject. You're giving them a question that they have to answer. Now, maybe this means that they don't choose the answer that you want, but what you're doing is you're getting them to ask questions that they haven't asked before. This will not get you any overnight results. There's no instant gratification to be found here. But if the left ever wants to succeed, judging by this election, there's still millions of people out there that we have to win over and help show them why these policies are supported by science and are supported by the majority of people and why they should support them too. Yes, there are irredeemable racists out there who are not interested in having an authentic conversation, who are not worth your time. But to say that all Trump supporters are racist completely dismisses millions of people, many of whom are in the categories of minorities that we're supposed to be fighting to protect anyways. From 2016 to 2020, Trump's support amongst minorities, despite everything he's done that's harmed them, has actually increased. So, to call every Trump supporter a racist is narrow-minded, and it ends up leaving a lot of people isolated. And dismissing them outright dismisses them collectively rather than as individuals, and completely lacks nuance. Maybe this is me coming from an evangelical background, but my insight to this isn't that we should be pushing these people away because we think they're irredeemable or hopeless or uneducated, but that we should be trying to recruit them. We should be trying to reach out to them, and we should be trying to help them. It doesn't matter whether they're white, black, Latino, LGBTQ, or whatever, like any of it. What matters is that we're trying to reach them and trying to help provide them a better environment, a better country to live in. And if we're not doing that, and if we're not accepting everyone, regardless of their education level, regardless of their political beliefs, then we're falling into that same tribalistic mentality that we've been accusing the other side of for forever, and we're not doing anything but creating more and more harm, and it's a runaway train. To attack and berate people who are uneducated and uninformed because they've been tricked and misled by politicians into voting for policies that go against their own interest is classist. And it goes completely against everything that the left is supposed to stand for. If we are to have any hope of defeating this tribalistic mentality in America, then we have to stop participating in it. So where do we go from here? Well, for starters, we have to make sure that we're willing to call out politicians on both sides of the aisle and make sure that we're holding them accountable, regardless of whether or not that politician happens to serve our own interests. When people on the right see us calling out right-wing politicians but ignoring the flaws of people on the left, they see that as hypocritical, and they're right. And seeing that hypocrisy will push them further to the right. Secondly, we have to push for more diversity in our party. Not just among minorities who are not represented well in this country, which they absolutely should be better represented, but also between parties. Different political ideologies from all across the spectrum need more representation, whether it's a conservative or an economic liberal, lib-left, off-left, all of it. All the way from Marxism to libertarianism. That needs to be represented here in the United States as individual parties and not people devolving into two separate groups. Lastly, we have to change how we represent ourselves in our own personal conversations, myself included. We cannot continue to allow leftists and left people to bully and be belligerent to people on the right simply because they're uninformed. These are the people that we need to be reaching out to and helping to change their mind. And even if we can't do it in a simple conversation, oftentimes when we have that conversation, whether it's online or in person, there's going to be other people who are listening to it. And we have to make sure that those people who hear and read that conversation don't find themselves taking the side of conservative values that don't represent them simply because you were the more belligerent one. Again, let me reiterate, no one has ever been won over by being mocked. If you're going to engage with people, online or in person, make sure that you're keeping your composure, you're not getting emotional, and that you're stating facts, and that you're being respectful. No one's asking you to tolerate belligerent behavior when it's targeted at you. But at the same time, we cannot allow ourselves to fall into this pattern where we're comfortable being belligerent to people who disagree with us. And it happens all too often. At the end of the day, every single person that I've ever met and talked to had the same goal regardless of what their political beliefs were. We all want what's best for the country. Some of us just have conflicting ideas about how to get there. So the best way to reach out to these people isn't to attack them for believing that they're pursuing something that's best for the country, but to ask them questions, to try and engage with them respectfully, and to change their worldview slowly. This isn't a race. This isn't something we're going to win overnight. But if we can engage with people in a respectful manner that treats them like humans, rather than just lashing out and calling them racist homophobes because they happen to support a politician we don't like, then we can change the perspective. More importantly, we can get them out of their bubbles, their echo chambers that have locked them into this pattern where they only hear one sound. You could be the one person who acts as a break in their echo chamber. You could be the one person who's preventing them from being in a completely isolated bubble that prevents them from ever challenging the worldview that they hold. And I cannot state enough how important it is to have people around you who challenge that system. Socrates famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And that is the entire premise behind this channel. Everything that I'm going to do here, all the videos that we make, are going to be something where I attempt to get people to examine their own beliefs. But I wanted to start off by getting the left to examine ourselves, because myself included, there's this tendency to try and fluff our own egos by acting superior to people who we should be trying to win over. I am far from the most qualified person to do this. I've never even read Chomsky. But my hope is that I can open the door for you to ask questions about your own beliefs. Even if I don't change your mind, even if I don't completely radically change your worldview and turn you into a radical leftist who's all pro-Marxism, I'm not necessarily expecting that to happen. All I want is for you to not go through life without examining your own beliefs and asking questions as to how you got there. Because if you're anything like me, then you maybe grew up in a certain bubble where all you knew was one thing, and it took some radical questions coming from outside that chamber in order for you to actually find out who you really are. In my opinion, this makes us better people, and it equips us to deal with the world in a much better way. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Jeremiah. This is Unexamined. This is your obligatory reminder to like, comment, subscribe, and all that other stuff that every YouTuber throughout history has always told you to do. But I am told that statistically you are more likely to do it if I say it here. So do that, please. This is my first video, so any feedback that you have, I really would appreciate in the comments. Constructive criticism, praise, want to fluff my ego, whatever tickles your fancy. I would love all of it. And above all, don't let your life go unexamined.